Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Paul Heinbecker on Syria, Iran, and Canada's looming international role. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, the CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, the director of the Walsley School of International Affairs and CG Chair of Global Security. And as usual, I'm pleased to welcome an expert on some aspect of global governance here into the studios at the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. Today, I'm pleased to welcome back Ambassador Paul Heinbecker, who was my very first guest in this series a little over a year ago now. And at that time, we talked about your new book on Canadian diplomacy called Getting Back in the Game. And I'd like to come back to your book toward the end of this conversation, but in the meantime, perhaps we can start with your thoughts about what's been brewing in crisis points around the world, specifically Syria and Iran, and how Canada looks to be playing a role in managing or possibly aggravating those crisis situations. Start perhaps with Syria. It's been a very active file, and Canada's been surprisingly active on the diplomacy side, but not so active in other respects.
Well, Syria is a tough question. Most fundamentally, it raises the issues of the responsibility to protect, which was a Canadian-born idea, made in Canada idea, adopted by the UN. It was basically the principle under which the intervention in Libya took place. And we now have a situation where, which is meeting the criteria of the responsibility to protect, probably. Certainly, where the UN is now talking about 7,500 people having been killed. The government can't protect, won't protect, and in fact is the perpetrator of much of the damage which is taking place there. 7,500 people killed, the Syrian military being used to attack civilian areas. Not only civilians in those areas, but we can see from the news accounts of the destruction that's going on, the number of innocents who are being killed, the number of children who are being killed, the absolutely brutal is not a strong enough word for the kind of behavior that we're seeing out of the Syrian forces. Children being tortured in order to, I suppose, intimidate their families and others. It's a brutality at a level that is really shocking. So if you're talking about the criteria of the responsibility to protect, certainly we're at the point now where I think we can take the view that there is widespread killing taking place. It's not apprehended anymore, but it's apprehended in the sense that more can well happen. There is historical precedent. This looks very much like what Assad's father did in Hama, back in the 80s, in which he effectively put down a kind of an insurrection by destroying a lot of people. It looks like that's the same game plan we're seeing. He's not being he's not being restrained or is not listening to the Arab countries, none of whom are supporting him now. The only support he seems to have is active support is from Iran and Russia, for reasons which are not clear to me, except it's kind of the old-fashioned religion. The old-time religion. Russia hasn't got any more client states left in the Middle East. This is the only one. Russia uses a base there. Russia sells weapons. None of these things are worthy of a superpower like Russia. These kind of motivations are important, but they shouldn't be decisive, I don't think. And the Russians don't seem to be calculating what the rest of us are coming to think of them for supporting the Syrian regime. We're seeing a bit more flexibility, I think, from the Chinese, and maybe the Russians will come around to it. Kofi Annan is now involved. This is, I think, if Kofi Annan can't bring about a solution to this issue, a diplomatic solution to this issue, then there isn't going to be one, because he is undoubtedly the most experienced person there is to be doing this. He has the backing of the Arab countries. He has the backing of the United Nations, including, one imagines, the Chinese and the Russians. And so his intervention is extremely important. That said, the Syrians are certainly in a feel themselves to be in a kill or be killed kind of situation. They're not prepared to yield to anybody, and they think that at least the regime and possibly their own heads depend on prevailing. So the chances of this getting still bloodier are very good.
Now, Russia and China did veto a UN resolution that wouldn't have done much, right? It would more or less endorse a Arab League name and shame and push for a resolution. Nobody's actually talking, at least within government circles, about a responsibility to protect, and everybody has signaled that there's no enthusiasm for a Libya-style action on the basis of that.
Part of that is, I mean, frankly, you have a U.S. election going on. This is an election year in the United States. The president wants to run in part on bringing the boys home, bringing them home from Iraq already, and with the promise of bringing them home from Afghanistan. He doesn't want that message to the American people to be confused by another message that he's going to war in Syria. I think that's one of the major considerations. I think that the Syrians the Syrian military is a tougher proposition than the Libyan military was ever going to be. It's a bigger country, more people, much more equipment, many more tanks, many more heavy weapons. Some weapons of mass destruction, in terms of chemicals and possibly biological weapons. And so the getting involved militarily seems likely to be more costly. But you know, one of the things that's happened in the last 15 or 20 years, there's been since the Gulf War, we're seeing the influence of technology on warfare, and we've had two interventions, one in Kosovo and the other more recently in Libya, in which the intervening side has not so much as broken a fingernail. These conflicts have been won from the air, the ground work being done by local forces. But the interveners have effectively been able to do that at no human cost, and have been able to, and their capacity for doing it by using drones is only getting greater. So at a certain point, I think the decisive thing is fundamentally the American election. If the election was not on, if the president was not in such a difficult campaign, and if he, if he didn't need to be able to show himself of having a kind of circumspect foreign policy in which he's not, bringing the troops home, I think we might see a greater willingness to do something there.
Maybe a little later in the year.
Maybe.
You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So, Paul, the other big hot topic in the area is Iran. And,
Iran.
Sanctions have been tightened. Life is getting difficult in the streets of Iran. There's been a lot of beating of drums. Israel is signaling that it is at least willing to consider unilateral action to try to delay, if not destroy, which is impossible, the Iranian nuclear program. And Iran's been threatening to close the Straits of Hormuz to oil shipments if necessary to try to open up the oil pipelines again. So how do you see, first of all, how do you see the Iran situation evolving in the short term, but especially in light of the fact that there's an additional drama unfolding in Syria, and those two countries are tightly interlinked. And it's not exactly the same problem, but they're very closely associated problems.
Well, the fundamental question is whether Iran gets the bomb or Israel or the United States bombs Iran, and which is whether those are the only two alternatives there are, and if they were the only two alternatives, which would produce a worse outcome. I'm strongly of the view that attacking Iran is taking an enormous risk, that it would cause upset all over the Middle East and well beyond, especially if, as would be the case, even an Israeli attack on Iran would be interpreted by the Iranians and by the rest of the Muslim world as an American-supported Israeli attack on Iran. I think there's a fairly serious chance that that an Israeli action would drag the Americans into a war they don't want to be in. They're in an election year. They don't want to have that war. They may not want to have that war in any circumstance, but they certainly don't want to have it on the eve of an election. So I think that the Israelis are setting up time frames by which action must be taken about the existence of weapons and so on. And I must say it reminds me of my experience at the UN. It reminds me of the Iraq War. There we were told that military action was necessary because of the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein had. The evidence for that was poor. The world went ahead, or the Americans and the British went ahead and attacked anyway. And we saw the enormous price the Americans had paid as a consequence, in terms of their international reputation, in terms of the loss of life of Americans, in terms of the loss of life of many, many more Iraqis. Mm-hmm. So these are wars. These are not surgical operations. We're not playing war games here. We're not, it's not something that operates on a you do out of your basement.
No, as you know, war games are part of the planning process,
yeah.
so the option evaluation process.
Yes.
And
yeah.
My understanding from everyone I've spoken to is that nobody has played a war game involving an attack on Iran that actually has a positive outcome for anybody involved in the attack on Iran, neither the United States nor Israel. So the military argument so far is nil.
Yeah. And the Israelis themselves, judging by what I read in Israeli newspapers, are themselves divided on the wisdom of this, and there's in the cabinet there are those who believe that whatever that they can carry out do enough damage to the Iranian nuclear program that it would be worthwhile, and that any Iranian response would be tolerable. And there are others who think that who are not so confident about the first, and are even less confident about the second. And in all of this, there's a calculation also that what do the American people think in this? How would, if the American people concluded that they had been dragged into a war that might not have had to be part of, how are they going to react to that? What's that going to mean for the American-Israeli relationship? I think there are enormous stakes in play here. And I think that the countries who present themselves as friends of the Israelis really, I think, ought to be counseling circumspection here. The Israeli argument is, people drag up the argument from Second World War. If Hitler had been stopped early enough, none of the tragedy would have happened. Particularly the Holocaust wouldn't have happened. But it's always dangerous in my mind to be drawing historical analogies. Nothing is always the same. Nothing is similar enough. I think the situation we're in is that you have basically a failed state or a failing state in Iran. I think the sanctions are making a difference. And there's, if you were able to contain and to deter Stalin, who had killed scores of millions of people in the Second World War, somebody as crazy as that, if you were able to deter the Chinese under Mao, it isn't obvious to me why you can't deter the Iranians. Why the Iranians, who have not so far in recent years, at least overtly attacked anybody, would shift gears and become that kind of threat. I think I think that the dangers to the Middle East, the dangers to the international economy. It isn't. People talk about the Straits of Hormuz being blocked. if you can block the Straits of Hormuz even temporarily, and the 20% of the world's oil that flows through there, it's not obvious to me why attacks wouldn't be possible on the Saudi oil fields, for example. People are sort of counting on the Saudis to pump the extra oil that would make it okay and would reduce the economic impact. Maybe they won't be able to do that. But I think in terms of there being yet one more military conflict between the West and a Muslim country, I think that that's an incalculable negative. I think that we considered the war in Iraq to be a recruiting effort for Al Qaeda. I think we would see that again. There are 1.3 billion Muslims. If you radicalize 1% of them through this, that gives you 13 million terrorists. That's a war you can't win. So I think the smart thing to do here is to think about deterrence, to think about containment, put the emphasis on diplomacy, to press ahead with the sanctions, but not to take the position that there will be an attack one way or another on Iran, because I fear that the consequences will be worse.
Very good. We'll be back with Paul Heinbecker in just a moment. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Just to follow up a bit more on the Iranian story. There's no urgency. There's no apparent urgency. We know that Iran has a program. We don't have a lot of detail about the program. They claim it's for civilian uses. Almost certainly it's not. But we do know, based on the experience of other regimes that had similar kinds of programs, that they tend to bluff and bluster and make grandiose claims about progress, and at the end of the day don't have very good quality programs that are much slower or even completely ineffective in attaining a goal. Very, very insightful piece on this by Jacques Hymans in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist recently. And if that analysis is right, this is not a looming urgent prospect. At the same time, somebody, we think Israel or the Americans, maybe both, have actually been doing quite a lot behind the scenes to try to delay whatever program Iran has, the Stuxnet virus, targeting centrifuges, targeted assassinations in the streets. It's almost as though you could tell a very strongly positive story about the need to do nothing, about just sort of watch and wait and see how things unfold in the Iranian domestic scene.
Well, I think that that's right. If you're an Israeli, and if you consider the history of the Jews and the history of the Holocaust, it's not surprising that people are saying never again, and they don't want to be in a position where they are those kinds of atrocities can be perpetrated again. That's more than understandable. The difficulty they face, I think, is a judgment about what's going to be effective. And no one seems to believe that an attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities would deter Iran sine die from producing a nuclear weapons program. And if you look at the intelligence, the best intelligence there seems to be, the U.S. National Intelligence Estimate, there was a declassified version in 2007, and that's been followed up by some other documents and also by statements by leading American intelligence officials, including the head of the CIA and the U.S. Department of Defense, that they don't think that the Iranians have made a decision to give themselves nuclear weapons. They think that they are working on developing a capability for doing that, but that they're not actually developing a weapon. And that's a position that they took in 2007, and they're maintaining that position based on what they know. I'm always a little bit of skeptical of intelligence, because I know that intelligence can get overinterpreted, it can miss things, it can add 2 and 2 and get 20. You have to be very careful about that. But I think if you looked at the situation as dispassionately as you can now, you would come to the conclusion that you should keep the pressure on diplomatically on the Iranians, You should try to find some sort of diplomatic way forward, and I think that that's possible as the Iranian economy comes under more and more pressure from the sanctions. But that you should not take the view that it's sort of now or never in terms of a military attack. It may be now or never for the Israelis. It may not be. I'm not sure what the facts are on that circumstance. The Israelis talk about a zone of immunity that would be created once the Iranians put their nuclear capabilities further underground. That would not be the case from the perspective of the Americans, and it may not even be the case from the perspective of the Israelis, depending on how that intervention might be done. So I think giving yourself these kind of time frames. This also reminds me of what we saw in the war against Iraq, where we were told that the war had absolutely to be started before the end of March because it became too hot to fight. There were sandstorms. And what did we see? Well, we saw the Americans stay on for 7 more summers fighting an insurgency. So the idea that you couldn't fight in those conditions, which was preposterous anyway because they'd fought all the way through Vietnam, which were the conditions were at least as bad. My judgment is to be very careful about setting arbitrary deadlines that may very well turn out to be to force your hand, but not necessarily to be real. Force your hand in a political sense. So we have the situation where the IAEA report and the IAEA is expressing suspicion of Iranian activities. The Iranians are not allowing the IAEA to see some of those activities. But no one in the IAEA has said that there is a Iranian nuclear weapon. The Americans are not saying there's an Iranian nuclear weapon, and what they are saying is that there's a kind of a program to give themselves the capability of producing a weapon. I think so long as we're at that level, the rationale for an attack, I think, is and considering the consequences, the probable consequences. I hear people saying, well, it wouldn't be so bad, it would be surgical, or it wouldn't be so bad, the Iranians would not react. I think it would not react vigorously. I don't know who is interpreting who's making those kind of judgments, because I don't think we know enough about how the Iranians would respond. Obviously, they wouldn't respond in a way that brought about their destruction. There wouldn't be any kind of an attack on Washington. But I don't think you can predict how that's going to happen. And I think that the difficulty that the Israelis face, frankly, is that if they were to launch an attack, and if the retaliation was against the United States primarily, as it might well be, American troops in Afghanistan, American shipping in the Gulf, American interests in the Gulf, American interests around the world, that will have a geopolitical consequence that I think the Israelis really need to think about.
We'll be back once more with Paul Heinbecker. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So I said at the beginning I'd like to come back to your book, which helped us launch this podcast series. And at the time, you were making the argument that Canada had essentially gotten out of the game of international politics. And looking back over the past more than a year now at Canadian foreign policy, I wonder whether you think at least the government of Canada thinks that it is getting back in the game, and if so, in what way? We've seen a very active Canadian role in Libya. The government likes to think of itself more as a hard security contributor to global security rather than a soft security contributor. Interesting role in Syria because we've been involved with the Friends of Syria summit, and we are implicated in the Israeli-U.S. relationship on the issue because we're so overtly pro-Israeli. And remains to be seen about our possible role in the Iran crisis. But is there a pattern? Are we getting back in the game, and is it in a way that you think would be beneficial to the interests of Canada?
Well, to some extent, yes, and to some extent, no. My book came out, coincided as it happened, with the UN Security Council vote, in which we lost. The other members, the membership vote, the UN members, knowing Portugal was financially bankrupt, preferred Portugal to Canada, and they preferred Portugal to Canada in part because of the policies that we had been following. One of which was a certain indifference to the UN. I think they perceived a policy that was very pro-Israeli, the most pro-Israeli of any country, without any corresponding gestures towards the interests and the rights and the suffering of the Palestinian people. Climate change, we walked away from our responsibilities. We haven't put anything in place that really would really fill the void. On Africa, we basically decided, we announced that we weren't very interested in Africa anymore, and shifted our attention to Latin America. So these are, all of those things added up to a certain way of conducting foreign policy, and they were read by the international community accordingly, and the international community was not very impressed by it. I think on the positive side, from that perspective, not everybody would agree with me with this, but I think we stuck with it on Afghanistan as in a way which I think gives us credit. I think in Libya, although we didn't want to mention the responsibility to protect, I think, because this was regarded as a policy of the previous Liberal government, that nonetheless the Canadian government did get involved, and I think did the right thing in getting involved, and played an effective role there, just as we had done in Kosovo, by the way. There is a certain amount of, I don't know how to put it, the idea that we're shifting from sort of soft power to hard power is really quite, I think, an error. There's always been hard power and soft power. Soft power is a term that was created by Joe Nye, who had been Deputy Secretary of Defense of the U.S. And an academic at Harvard. And the idea is that you have influence in the world and you have power in the world because of your own success. You have a successful society, you have a highly competent military, but people fundamentally would want to emulate you. You get what you want by co-option and not by coercion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The hard power is coercion, soft power is co-option. People see a reason to do the kind of things that you would like them to do because they think it's in their interests. They emulate the kind of policies you follow because they think those policies are successful. They like to create a situation where the human and political and civil rights of people are protected because they think that works. So we actually also have soft power. If you look at the immigration intentions of people around the world, we probably are the most attractive country. People do want to come to Canada. They do see that we have a society that's worth emulating. They do give us a hearing internationally, partly because of who we are and how we handle our domestic situation, and how we deal with human rights, how successful we are economically, how good our banks are, how our banking system is.
So in terms of our international influence and our international
Mm-hmm.
role, I mean, my reading of your book was that the world had more or less watched us squander or withdraw.
Well, I think we had withdrawn to the sidelines. We had, we were not taking an active role that we could have.
Are we positioned now to?
I think we're positioned better now. I think the government's had more time in office. I think they've gone up a learning curve. I think, for example, that the relationship with China and the notion that we need to have a strategy for Asia and a strategy for China, I think that is a sign of maturity. I think that the government has recognized that a kind of bumper sticker approach, bumper sticker mentality approach to an issue as complicated as China was really not going to serve our interests. So I think that we're doing better there. I think that we did well on Libya. I'm not sure that where we stand on Syria. The government is very much aware of how complicated and dangerous intervention in Syria would be. But I don't sense any leadership in those areas so much as I sense, I guess, participation. That's not trivial. I think that is an important step forward, because there was a kind of a tendency to believe that, you know, poor little Canada, what could we do? Well, it actually turns out we can do quite a bit if we're doing it intelligently and in partnership with other people who are also doing it. I think that it's one of the ironies is that had we been on the Security Council through this period, we would have a lot more sound position. We'd be able to make a much more constructive contribution to the issue of Syria because we'd be on the council while this was being discussed, for example. We'd also be able to have a greater influence. A country like Canada needs to have vehicles. We don't have a lot of the capacity to act on our own. And one of the vehicles is multilateral organizations, and one of those is the UN, and another is NATO. We need to, when we have those vehicles, we can have a bigger impact than when we don't have. So I think that we lost something by not being on the Security Council, and we haven't recovered it yet. It didn't mean then, and it doesn't mean now, that we were somehow out of business. But we put ourselves in a position where it was much more difficult for us to have the influence we'd like to have.
Maybe we see the beginnings of edging back into the.
I think we're coming back. I think, but I don't. But you know, the idea that we're going to come back through military capability alone is a mistake.
Well, thanks again, as always, Paul, for coming in and sharing your insights and your expertise, and thanks to our audience for joining us. Join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. You can look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.